Thank you very much for choosing the Situation Room. This is Kenya's biggest conversation. We're broadcasting in Nairobi, 94.4, Mombasa, 87.9, 102.5 in Kisumu, 96.7 in Eldoret, 96.0 in Nakuru, Nyeri, 90.9 and 97.7 in Malindi. We live stream every morning this show on Spice FM, Spice FM KE on Facebook, Spice FM KE on YouTube, as well as our website, www.spicefm.co.ke. You know, every time we talk about corruption in this country, and we've got cartoonists in our media houses. There's one very famous cartoonist who likes to depict corrupt leaders as hyenas. And they're the ones that have now gone to Langata Road this morning. Probably there. Now that we're just discussing, corruption in the country and all these kind of malfeasance by political leaders. So this is the conversation that we have now. It's about investigative journalism. We have seen investigative stories actually being carried out in our local media houses. A number of stories have emerged over the years. For example, the story about Anglo leasing was unearthed by a media house, and this was a couple of years ago, decades ago. The Goldenberg scandal as well, the Anglo leasing scandal. We've seen other scandals that have emerged. We've seen deep investigative stories that have been done, telling us about the drug cartels and the drug kingpins in Kenya and the drug networks in East Africa. We've seen stories about the status of our food safety in the country. We've seen stories that have told us about people who are stealing from other countries and coming to invest in Kenya, or coming to invest via Kenya, or using Kenya as conduits for money. This is what we shall be discussing this morning, and we're joined by John-Allan Namu. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Eric.
And thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, albeit late. I apologize for my tardiness.
You're right on time, man. You're right on time. Nobody else knows. You shouldn't have said it.
No, well, disclosure. That's what journalism is about.
Right.
Yeah.
So you run an outfit now called Africa Uncensored. You're
Yes.
a co-founder of Africa Uncensored.
Yes.
How many years is Africa Uncensored now?
So on November the 30th, that'll be our 4th year anniversary. So we're just about getting to 4 years old.
Mm-hmm. What have you done in the 4 years?
That's a tough question. What we've tried to focus on as much as possible is in-depth and investigative stories that are of public interest nature. Trying as much as possible to focus on systemic problems and issues that need reform in our country and outside of our country. And just doing the best that we can, to be honest. That's really what we've been trying to do for the past 4 years. Yeah.
And then, of course, you've done a couple of stories that have aired on media houses, local and international.
Yes.
Others that have aired on other platforms as well.
Yes.
And just, we know the thing about investigative journalism is, of course, you're ruffling feathers.
Mm-hmm.
And it brings in an issue of security as well. Even when you're working here in KTN, there's a time when you were doing a story and you had actually to take cover for a while.
Yeah.
Do you still face the same challenges now that you're working alone without the cover of a big organization?
Well, fortunately not yet. I say not yet because I know somewhere in the future that's going to happen. But I think what these past 4 years have done, and I guess collectively thinking about the arc of my career as well as the career of others, is that investigative journalism really isn't. I think the danger is something that we focus on as a consequence of kind of the things that we do. But the principle of investigative journalism is really about reform, right? So we're looking at problems, structural problems and others for the purpose of reform.
Yes.
And if you look at it that way, and if you try as much as possible to be as objective as possible in the pursuit of that goal, then danger becomes something that minimizes, right? That becomes minimal, because then you're not looking at a person as you're not looking to do like gotcha journalism. You're not trying to expose a person and show them to be this awful monster of a person, but really you're looking at them as a sort of person, or I don't know why my words are failing me today, as a vehicle through which the kind of problems that are expressed and the pressures that are put on the public are expressed. So in that way, investigative journalism then now becomes something that's less about the danger and more about the reform. So that's how I'm trying to look at it, and especially in these 4 years, that's what I've tried to do with the people who I work with.
In the time you've been involved in, first of all, good morning.
Good morning.
Yes.
And nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Yeah.
My name is Muga, C.T.
Yes,
Muga.
yes. I see your billboard.
You do.
Quite popular.
It's actually the Standard Media billboard in which I feature.
All right.
Yes. But
To
thank
me,
you.
it is all of your billboards. You might as well have paid for them.
All our billboard, yes.
Yes.
In the time you've been involved in investigative journalism, could you tell us and tell our listeners if some of the work that you've been involved in has actually brought about structural change either in society or in our country?
In a
or
way,
influenced?
well, I think it's influenced debate. It has influenced some change. An example I can give, for instance, is the report that we did on Victor Kanyari, this pastor who unfortunately still operates. What it did is it informed a debate and some movement in the Office of the Attorney General around regulation of religious institutions, which I think is something that's necessary to look at. There are other stories that I think it started to inform the debate around how the security state, for instance, problems of radicalization, problems of extrajudicial executions, and police brutality are things that we focused on for a long time. And pivoting away from that is now countering violent extremism. How do you do that? I think I can't say that our reports were responsible for movements in that way, but they did inform the debate. And it's difficult for me to pinpoint to one that says that this moved the needle in this way, although I'm sure there might have been one or two. But that's really what the role of journalism is generally, and investigative journalism. I don't think the expectation of us should be that you do a story and change happens. That would be the perfect situation. But investigative journalism and journalism generally, what you guys are doing here, informs a discussion, which then moves a needle forward and helps society be better informed, make better decisions, and become better as a whole. That's how I look at it. Yeah.
Now, what sources of funding do you have?
So
Are
we
you willing
have
to disclose all of them.
Oh yeah, they're on our website.
Okay.
Yeah, so we have both commercial sources of funding and funding from grant-making organizations.
International ones.
Yes.
Okay. So could they be driving an agenda, perhaps? Do you think?
They might have their own agendas, but they don't drive them through us.
You don't have to then stick to particular sort of narratives, or if they're paying you, they're giving you money to create programs.
Yes.
You don't think you would then have to be in line with their thinking?
No.
You don't find that restrictive? You can go against what they're pushing for?
Yes.
You don't have to be aligned to their goals?
No, I don't.
Okay, you don't find it compromises you in any way to get external funding or funding outside the country and then be reporting on, say, the Kenyan security system?
I don't think so, because there's never been a time that editorially someone has come and told me that you have to push a certain line, that someone has told me that you have to come and say a certain thing. Anything that we have done as Africa Uncensored, and I can stand behind this 100%, has been things that have been informed by our own observations of society.
And when they're funding you, what is their vision? Is it to expose Kenya? Or?
That's a difficult question to answer in terms of architecturally what their vision is. I really can't speak for what my funders' visions are.
Does it worry you that they might have alternative agendas, that you might be playing fiddle to their tune without realizing it inadvertently?
Of course it does. It does worry me. And that I'm alive to it means that I'm alive to the fact that I could be used in some way.
And that doesn't affect your sense of patriotism?
How do you ensure, not just patriotism, how do you ensure that you stay true to the cause of journalism in what you're doing when you've got support, even if not international, even if it was local, even if it was government funding you? How do you ensure that you remain true to what you seek out to do?
The method in the journalism. I think people think that investigative journalism is just something about exposing things and speaking ill about your society. That's not true. The method that we follow is a very strict method. It's the hypothesis method, and it's something that's being used in societies that you speak about as well. Societies that also support our work. The Scandinavians, for instance, right? And how the hypothesis methods work is that you come out with you have a statement that you start with, and you prove and disprove it, or disprove it. So you'll find evidence that could be incriminatory or exculpatory.
But of course, you could have confirmation biases depending on what your perspective is. So it's just this notion that I want to put forward, that once you're being funded, especially internationally, you can compromise your independence and your perspective.
That is possible, but I'd ask the same question of the Standard Group. The Standard Group is a proprietary organization owned by people who have political interests, active political interests at that. Does that influence the conversation on this show? I'd argue not, because there are certain independent minds on this show that have their own view about how to express these things.
But perhaps there's restrictions.
There might be restrictions for me.
But where on earth are there no restrictions?
I think when you're doing something as sensitive as you've done, especially with I refer especially to the security issues that you've exposed in Kenya in terms of extrajudicial killings and so on, and then you have international bodies that are actually sponsoring your projects. I think you'd be a little bit naive to completely overlook the fact that there might be a conflict there in terms of internal security, and this is an international firm or another country coming to fund such activities. Just let's flip the script, whereby, let's say, a guy from Thika wants to fund somebody to go and unearth information about what sort of the MI5 get up to and so forth. I don't think a journalist would take this money from the guy from Thika. They would look more into it and try and understand what is the Kenyan interest here. Why are they giving me money to unearth information on the MI5, for instance? And I'm not saying that your story was true or not true, or it was the NIS involved or what have you. I'm just giving you an example. And most countries just wouldn't let that happen, where an international organization comes and funds a journalist to go and unearth security-related stories.
Actually, most countries do let that happen, and that happens across the world. I think what you're missing, Nyeri, is that the aims of the journalist, as well as the principles of the journalist, are a very important sieve in determining what goes on and what doesn't. And at the end of the day, the person who will be responsible for that, whether or not another person has an agenda, is the journalist themselves. If they do follow their job, if they do follow the ethics that they are supposed to adhere to locally, and which is what we do, then that shouldn't be as big a problem as as you're looking at it, right? Of course, I'm not blind to these things. Of course, there are organizations, international organizations, that have their own agendas. And when we go seeking for funding from these different organizations, we also look at these agendas.
Right.
And we have said no to organizations that we feel compromise our values and compromise our judgment.
You have a commercial aspect to also how you raise money as well, right? This is by, let's say, selling stories or selling them to organizations, media organizations or corporate organizations.
Yeah.
So do you also encounter that kind of challenge when you say you're bringing a story, let's say, to a certain media house, and a certain media house then, as you said, of course we know in Kenyan media houses there's always the person at the top has some leanings, and then you get that interfering with the kind of work that you've done, or them telling you edit this and remove the other, or add this into the other. So how do you overcome that, and what is it that actually hampers investigative journalism when it comes to this sense?
All right, to the specific example of whether there have been requests to change or editorialize some of our content, our view is this: if your suggestions improve the work that we are doing, then we are all for it. We will take it, and we protect that right, and we respect that people have their own editorial views, their own editorial line. But when it comes to editorializing or giving input that seeks to water down stories, or seeks to push a certain agenda or to remove certain agendas that media house does not conform to, when we've done our work as journalists on the ground, then that we don't stand for. And I'm sitting in an organization where I've had to have that very painful discussion itself, right? That happened to us last year, just about 13 months ago, right, with this organization, and that's the line that we took. We respected their right, and we said we disagreed with it, and we chose to go by ourselves. That's what happened.
Do you find that now, going on your own, does that then allow you the freedom to actually, get into the underbelly of some of these issues that you find could maybe in one way dog society, or whereby they're holding back information that, if we look at the citizenry and say that there's information that they should know about processes on a day-to-day basis, things that they get involved in. Do you find that you can actually go further in sending out this information on your own?
I find that we definitely have the freedom to do so, right? Many times we don't have the money to do so.
Right.
That's really the challenge. We have the freedom to go as far as we want, but sometimes it's just a restriction. Maybe there might be a story that has transnational perspectives to it that we can only follow up until the border between Kenya and whatever country, right? Maybe there's something that we're digging into here internally that we can only go as far as we can, and we go as far as our resources allow us to, and that's really just the honest truth, right? But in terms of the restrictions, what it does mentally for us is that it frees us to think of any idea, any story that we can pursue, and that's really what the attitude is at Africa Uncensored.
And on to what end? Because I think that's really important. If you look at investigative journalism, any kind of journalism, when you're trying to unearth or trying to spread information. I mean, we've talked about how it can influence discourse, which is absolutely important. I mean, we're sitting in this room every day, and it's very important to have some of these discussions and have some of these conversations. But then with investigative journalism, particularly, to what end, what kind of impact are we looking to have in the future? And you obviously know that some of the impact, some of it is not immediate. It could be years to come before you see, some of it. But then what kind of impact then are we looking for? Are you looking for? Should other journalists be looking for?
We are, as investigative journalists, generally, I am specifically looking forward to a time when investigative journalism is not necessary for reform. We're working towards, and this is very... it's a very utopian way of thinking, but I can't resist thinking about it in this way. Looking forward to a day when investigative journalism is not particularly necessary for a society to be able to make the reforms and make the changes that it requires for everybody, as far as possible, for as many people as possible, to benefit from that society and to be active members, active citizens within that society. That's really what I'm looking for personally. I'm looking forward to a time when the man on the street has as much value as the person sitting in the corridors of power. And it sounds philosophical, but this is actually a possibility if we focused on some of the things that we're looking at as changes and they actually did them. So that's really what the role of investigative journalism is. I think... if you were to look at another investigative journalist like Anas Arimayo Anas in Ghana, he has a very, very specific agenda, which I respect, which is name, shame and jail, right? Yeah. So his exposés are...
CT would like him.
Yeah. Oh,
I would love that person. No. I would really love the person.
Yeah, and he's done fantastic work. But we have to recognize that there are certain differences in our society versus, and I'm speaking specifically about Kenya versus Ghana, that wouldn't allow us to collect evidence in that way, and use it as journalism, right? But I think why I respect Anas so much is because he's chosen to forge his own path, looking at his society and do things, whether he's right or wrong in the end. Yeah, he wants to influence change immediately. I look at it more architecturally, right? I might be wrong in my view, but that's why I respect him so much.
We have in the studio with us John-Allan Namu. He's a multi-award winning investigative journalist, a co-founder of Africa Uncensored. We're here talking about the impact of investigative journalism in society, especially in Kenya. And that's a question that we've just come out of. Let him have a sip of water as we continue this conversation. This is a Situation Room. This is Kenya's biggest conversation. In about 10 minutes, we'll also be opening up the phone lines for you to participate and ask him questions and join in the conversation. Good morning.
mature, intelligent talk every morning. Spice up yourself. Mornings done right. 94.4 Spice FM, Nairobi.
22 minutes after 8 o'clock, this is Kenya's biggest conversation at the Situation Room. We have John-Allan Namu, multi-award winning investigative journalist, the co-founder of Uncensored. As we went into this break, John, you were talking about, the impact of investigative journalism, and that's a question that Ndu had asked you. And he said you look at it architecturally, long term. You don't see, you're not seeking an immediate impact. So really, if you're doing an investigative piece and you do not want it to impact on your audience, so...
No, I think... Okay, let me nuance that answer. I look at my journalism generally as influencing society over the long term. Of course, there will be those stories that you want passionately for something to change, right? I'll give an example of Dennis Okari's story, right? White Alert. That's something that you want immediate change.
Action on, yes.
Immediate action. We've done stories as well about, for instance, illicit financial flows coming in from South Sudan. That's something that change that can be taken immediately, right? Immediately. But it doesn't happen. It's always the hope of a journalist that there'd be some immediate change. But given the time that I've put in this industry, I know that that's very rarely true. That's very rarely true that there'll be some immediate.
So you've recalibrated your expectations.
I think I'm just being realistic about it. I'm just being realistic about it. I want change now, but I hope for change in the future. I hope that this adds to the institutional memory of a country where we can return to some of these things and say that there was a path that was charted, or that there were pointers that were made, and now we can follow up on that.
There are a few, if we're looking at this country specifically, there are a handful of investigative journalists who actually do this job to the detail that we've seen, the likes of yourself doing. Do we need more?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that investigative journalism should actually be a more mainstream form of journalism. I think that every media house should have an investigative desk, or some sort of investigative training, or journalists with an investigative mien working on daily beats. Because what that allows them to do is to always introspect, but also interrogate things a little more deeply than sometimes they are being. So yes, I think that there need to be a lot more investigative journalists. I don't think that I'd be serving anybody's interest by saying that we should remain as we are. And that's why, with the little experience that I have, we've, over the past 4 years, tried to help train investigative reporters. And I see myself segueing out of investigative journalism at some point into the future into the classroom.
Training and mentorship.
Do you think...
What is it that hampers that growth of or the establishment of very robust investigative desks in Kenyan newsrooms?
Not just Kenyan, but globally, this is the problem. Investigative journalism specifically serves a public good. A public good is immeasurable in how much you need to invest in it, or how much you need, or how much it pays back, right? So if it is a public good, and I see it as a public good, then it should be publicly funded.
Okay, but just looking at, we've said that there need to be more, right?
Yeah.
The threats to security, and I'm talking about the threats to the individual who's carrying out this investigation.
Yes.
Do they not serve then as deterrents to those who would want to now uncover the truth, or seek the truth, or explore for the answers? Isn't that a deterrent for somebody to say, okay, this is great that we can uncover this, but then the threat to my life is more than I want to put on the bargaining table?
For sure. For sure. Those are threats that I consider every day. I have 4 children. I have a wife at home. I want to see them prosper. I want to see their graduation, their marriage. I want to have grandchildren.
Right.
Those are threats that I think of on a daily basis, right? And yes, those are things that would be deterrents. There are no easy answers to this.
Is there a body in this country to which investigative journalists belong?
Not as investigative journalists, no.
Internationally?
Internationally, there's a global investigative journalism network. There are a few. There's ICFJ, there's ICIJ. There are a few. And then in Africa, there used to be the Forum for African Investigative Reporters, now defunct, unfortunately, because of some maneno here and there. But
was money involved somewhere?
Yes.
That's the answer.
Yeah.
Can we call that political interference?
Yeah.
People paid to disrupt this thing.
Are there benefits to joining such organizations?
Oh, yeah, they are. For instance, we are now, making our way to joining GIJN. I think the one benefit that I'm personally getting from being part of that network and that organization,
Yes.
but that network generally, is the opportunity to sharpen my skills. Because investigative journalism is a bit of a community of practice.
Yes.
There's always knowledge being added to it on a daily basis. So like the resources page is one of my favorite pages on that website. And that's a great thing, I guess, generally about the internet, but specifically about investigative journalism, is that you can learn from people who are doing it, the mistakes that they've made, and perhaps also the gains that they've made to improve your own reporting.
I just want to look now. Even yesterday, we had this conversation and talking about the depth. Number one, it could be depth of knowledge and depth of expertise with which we see journalists operating in this country. Do we have enough? Because there's often been that, when it comes to reportage of journalists here, I mean, and easily across sub-Saharan Africa, I'm looking at other countries that we've seen the practice, that the depth is not enough. There's not depth of knowledge. There's not depth of reporting. It really is enough. And that, could you link that to some of the training that you even talked about? Do we need more?
Oh, yeah.
Or are we just picking people off having, have a degree in journalism, have a degree in mass communication, and come and do the job? It must go a little bit deeper, don't you think?
Yes, it does. It must go deeper. It should go deeper. But it speaks to something that Eric asked me earlier. What are some of the hindrances to growing investigative journalism? Is that kind of knowledge, that kind of depth takes time to be able to accrue, right? The kind of investment that you have to make in one person for them to then now become that kind of deep well of information and knowledge is a lot, right? And that's for a media infrastructure, for media infrastructure whose business model is failing right now. It's a huge investment, and perhaps not even necessary for them at this point in time. So we're being burnt at both ends. On the one end, the business model is failing. You can't use the newspaper to fund every other organization here.
No.
Advertisers can go directly to the market, right? Audiences are becoming much more far more picky about what they want to read, what they want to see, right? So the investment that you have to make in terms of people's time, for you to be able to get someone's time, is very, very high. And however, I think there is a future in making that investment, because when content becomes the central focus of any organization, any media organization's business plan, then you will be able to attract revenue from other streams that we haven't even thought of.
Right.
I want to come back to your funding.
Yes.
And who's responsible for your funding? Of
Yes.
course, you're a beneficiary or recipient of money from George Soros, who's, of course, an ideological billionaire intent on regime change in certain countries. We know he's been involved, or he's used his extraordinary wealth to bankroll and fund revolutions in dozens of European countries, including Czechoslovakia, Croatia, Yugoslavia. He was actually kicked out of his home Hungary. Well, he's of course American and Hungarian Jewish, but he was kicked out of Hungary for interference. He was involved in the Ukraine conflict. Basically, he uses his money under the false guise of promoting liberal democracy and his philosophy, but it's to interfere with regimes. He's been known to actually bring about a financial crisis in countries such as the UK with Black Wednesday and so on. How rigorous are you when you scrutinize the intention of your funders? Do you just take the money, or are you actually aligned to some of his agendas in Africa, which include change of regime and such like?
Sounds like a statement, not a question, but but this is how I think about George Soros and our funders generally. Do they interfere with our agenda? Open Society is a huge organization, right? And he chose to give money to that organization to be able to fund that. Point me to a story that I have done, right? Point me to a story that I have done in these 4 years where I've received funding from him, and I will tell you what the intentions of that story were. So in terms of scrutinizing his agenda, I cannot scrutinize his agenda all the way until the cows come home, because at least on the one hand, I know that there are certain people who act as sieves for that agenda if that agenda exists, right? And that's why an organization is built, to be able to save people from that kind of thing, or to be able to focus it. And in my experience with working with Open Society, that hasn't been my experience. And I'd ask people again, point me to a story that I have done. Point me to an issue that
Can you, as a recipient, seriously, completely isolate yourself from what their intentions and what their visions are?
I can't, Nyeri.
As a recipient of their funds,
their intentions are one thing. Their interference and coming to tell you do this story
is quite another.
It can be done subtly and sadly, inadvertently by yourself.
Let's take a look at traffic, John. Let's take a look at traffic, and then we come back for you to respond to this question. Right. It's 28 minutes to 9 o'clock. Good morning.
Nairobi.
On the hot seat is multi-award-winning journalist, investigative journalist John-Allan Namu, who's the co-founder of Uncensored. Of course, you know John-Allan Namu. Now, before we went into the break, John, you were responding to questions of who funds you. I mean, how you're funded and how you ensure that you retain editorial independence from your funders.
Yeah, and what I was going to say before we went to the break is that the intentions of our funder are one thing. Our intentions, I think, also should not be discounted. Secondly, we do not just go to one person to ask for these kinds of resources. We have a pool of organizations that fund us. That acts as a counterbalance for whatever interests that there might be at play. And we are, and then third, I think, and most importantly, we have our own editorial policy. And I'm very clear with anybody that I've ever gone to and anybody that I've ever approached to fund our work that this is the line that we take, right? I think people tend to overall the influence of money on certain agendas. Yeah. Again, like I said, I asked, who owns the Standard Group? We know that the Standard Group is owned by political organizations. We've seen that influence before. But I've also seen in my time here at the Standard Group that influence being rebutted by people at very senior levels. I've seen examples of journalism that is very brave, very, very bold, that goes against the direct interests of the owners of this organization. Flying. Right? And so why is it that on the one hand we're able to allow that locally or accept that argument locally, but the minute that the person funding the organization comes from another country, bears another passport, then there's we're being pointed to being not nationalistic or being patriotic. And by the way, on the argument of patriotism, in my view, is telling the truth about your country, not saving it from hard truths that it should actually pay attention to. If we were truly patriotic, for instance, about the argument of police brutality, we'd have handled this thing a long time ago. Wouldn't have waited for some poor boy to be beaten up in Juja for us to all sit up and say we have a problem. We've had a problem since colonial days, and there's a problem with the reform of that institution. If we were patriotic about it, wouldn't we want to reform that?
Would you accept funding from, let's say, Al Qaeda or
Of course
I'm just
not.
asking. I want to know too. At
Of
what
course
point?
not, Nyeri.
Because you say you have a very strong editorial policy in
Yes.
place, so you can take the money and then isolate yourself from their agenda.
Yes.
And this is where I go back to George Soros. This is an ideological billionaire who has brought down regimes. He has been known for revolutions, East and Central Europe. He has been known to interfere.
Former president accused of?
You see,
what is the former president?
The agenda of George Soros.
We can go down this rabbit
It's
hole.
very important to understand what his agenda is.
What has the former president been accused of? What has the former president been accused of in this country? We are dealing with corruption today, whose seeds have been planted by people who run this organization, who fund this organization. So if we want to go down that rabbit hole, let's go down that rabbit hole.
I wanted to
and then we also look at ourselves.
The point is, even in George Soros, I have a correction that has been sent here.
His editorial policy
I have a
was
correction
strong,
that
and
has
he
been sent here
isolates
to you,
himself
Jerry.
from
Talking
George
about
Soros.
that George Soros was evicted out of Hungary recently. He wasn't. George Soros left Hungary in the 40s. He went to study abroad, and he's still a Hungarian American citizen, but he was not evicted out of Hungary recently. So George Soros is one, and I think
out of the country quite recently. He's been trying to open a university in Hungary to
He has not been
to
kicked out
peddle.
of
He is
Hungary.
not
There has
allowed
been
in
an
Hungary.
issue
Where
of
are
the
you
current
getting your
president
sources?
of
Believe you me,
Hungary.
he is
The
not
issue-
allowed
Where are
in
you getting
Hungary.
your
He is
sources?
not allowed to open a university in Hungary, and he's been asked to leave Hungary. His funding has been asked not to enter Hungary. Basically, there's a lot more behind this man than meets the eye. He has been involved in a lot of regime change, a lot of interference.
And what is wrong with that?
democratically elected companies.
And what is wrong with that?
Companies.
What
Countries.
is wrong with
There's
that?
nothing
What
wrong
is
with
wrong
it.
with
And
somebody
I'm
who
asking
stands for
John-Allan
something?
Namu if he
And
has
I-
a problem with it.
Actually,
John
I want to
has
ask a
a
different
question.
question.
Yeah.
Right.
Jerry, are you suggesting that because John-Allan Namu receives money from this particular individual that you speak so spiritedly about?
The individual's organization.
Yes, and the individual's
That's
money.
the vehicle
yes.
through which he
So
gives out
are you
money.
suggesting
And I've
that-
asked, point me to a story. Point me to an agenda that
No,
I
I
have pushed.
think it then
Point me
taints
to
your
the
lens.
agenda.
No, my point
I'm
here
asking
is
a
point
different
me
taints
to
your
an
question.
lens.
agenda.
Are you saying,
City-
therefore,
City, ask
that
your question.
John-Allan Namu is involved in subversive
Activities
in
in
the
the country.
Toppling of regime.
Inadvertently, he could be, and yes, he
Yeah,
is
but why are we
actually
So the
why are
pushing
we
an
question that he's
agenda.
asking-
why are we
He's pushing
speaking
an
in
agenda that
generalities?
questions
Why are
the
we speaking
regime.
in generalities?
So,
I've asked
let's
very
now-
specifically.
so now, Jerry,
point
answer-
me to a story.
Jerry,
point
respond
me
to
to
that.
an
So it's a
agenda.
story you've done,
Point-
and I don't
which one?
defend extrajudicial
Which one?
killings.
Which
There's
one?
a story you've done on extrajudicial
Which
killings.
one?
Right.
The one I have seen, I forget what it's called.
When did I do it?
Maybe 2 years ago or less.
When?
I've come across it. You've done a story on extrajudicial killings.
Yes.
I'm not going to go into the exact details. Now, what
Why
I'm
not?
saying is when you have, because I don't need them, they're immaterial for the
No,
point I
they
want
are.
to make.
That,
No,
they
for the
are
point I-
material.
no, for the point I want
that
to
you're
make
making
right now.
The point that you're making,
the point
Jerry,
that I am
is
making is
my-
that you're
is
being
that my
funded by an
lens-
external regime
he said that my
interfering
lens
guy.
is being
Jerry.
that my
Absolutely.
lens
I'm
is being
an-
tainted. So
no,
point
You're
me
taking
specifically.
money
Yes.
from
Point
somebody.
me specifically
Okay.
to the story.
No,
Point me to the
my
line,
point
the
is-
phrase, the intention that I had when I was
It
talking
might
about
be inadvertent.
extrajudicial.
What
How
I'm
is it
saying is
inadvertent?
you're
I'm
attacking
directly
government.
saying it.
You're
Where
attacking
is
our
it?
government
How was
using
I attacking
external
your-
money.
how was I attacking
You're
Kenyan
attacking
government?
the government.
Jerry.
You're
Is
attacking
Is there or is there
internal
not a
security.
problem about
Using
extrajudicial
external
killings in this
money.
country? Is
John,
there
right.
or is there
John,
not?
It's
John,
important you
John,
realize
But
the
you
intentions
must-
and
you must
previous
point
actions
me.
of your
Hold on.
funders.
No,
Jerry.
you
John
must
Soros
point
is
me.
one of your funders.
You must
guys,
point
so
me.
is it that every time we have a guest, I've got to be doing this? All right. So, order. So, we start from this. CT Muga, go.
Eric, when an investigative journalist writes an article about extrajudicial judicial killing, how is that an attack on the government?
Exactly. Isn't there evidence that we
We
use?
we shall end this by having Jerry respond to this question. And the question was specific. Point the story, Jerry. Say, in this particular story that you did at this time, it pointed to this and this and
No,
the
that's
other
not
issue.
the way in which I
that-
want to present my argument.
Because
so, no,
your
I'm not going
argument
to do
is
that.
inductive in
no,
its
no,
reasoning.
no, no. It
That's
is
it.
not.
It
It is
is.
deductive. We have looked at
no,
judge.
it is
No, 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 no.
inductive.
My argument
Because
style
what you're
is
saying-
very reasoned.
No, no,
You
let
are
us
just
look. No, no,
reasoning.
no, no.
You are
Because
just
Let us
you're
reasoning.
look at
telling me
Judge
that I'm
Soros.
pushing an
Let
agenda.
us look
The
at
The only
Judge
way that
Soros.
I would
Let
push
us
an
look
agenda
at
is through my
John-Allan
story.
Namu's
Let's just use
reporting.
Through my
common sense
stories.
here.
Yes, that is common sense.
Okay, finish saying what
It
you're
would
saying
be-
and then I'll come
Yeah,
in.
it is
I am not
because-
going to use where I pinpoint a certain wording or a certain line in your documentary. What I'm going to do is from a very generalized perspective, actually honing down into specific, which is deductive reasoning, as opposed to coming in from one to generalizing. Now,
All
that is
right.
inductive reasoning.
All right.
So you're questioning my reasoning? Don't. Let's
Okay.
look at what Judge Soros does. This is an ideological billionaire. He has been involved in regime change. He puts money out there that people can use under the guise of promoting democracy and liberal democracy, he calls it.
Tell me about former President
if-
Moi's
if-
record
no,
with
no,
regard
no,
to
no,
corruption.
Hold on,
interrupt
hold
me.
on. Let's
and
hear this
forget
reasoning.
former Moi and so on.
Why not?
We
He's
are
the
talking
owner of
because
this organization.
Hold on, John.
Oh, here we go.
No,
but I'm
It's
just
getting
saying.
personal. He's now the owner of the
he's
organization. I am
he's
simply
part owner of
asking
this
you about your
organization.
funding,
Yes.
and then when you
Jerry,
do,
And I've been very
you're-
clear
when you
about
do
that.
documentaries
Jerry,
that
you're
concern
becoming
state
unruly
affairs,
because
how
here
am I
we,
unruly?
Because here we are discussing investigative journalism. John-Allan Namu is here. He's talking about Africa Uncensored. All right. You are now talking about civil society organizations and
we should be
toppling
able
of
to
the
talk
of
about
the world.
everything. John is an advocate for the truth.
But that's
And
not
I
why.
have
why,
I've not
why,
said
why
that we
should
can't
he
talk about
not
it.
like this line of questioning?
I don't like it. I'm responding to it.
The issue here is how has John-Allan Namu's work been impacted
Now, this
or
is
been
what I am coming
influenced,
to. You
or
cannot-
has he actually done it?
Okay.
Wait,
now,
because he has answered a question.
No,
and
no, no.
what-
You want
what
me
you-
to answer those
what you are
questions. I am giving
discounting-
you another perspective
I'm
that
getting-
is important
I'm finishing,
to consider.
I'm finishing
It
the
is
question.
important to consider. You actually
I'm finishing.
interjected with what I was
yes,
saying, Eric.
and I'm finishing
so
the
let
question
me finish,
because
then
you've
you
been
can
unruly
finish.
for 10
What
minutes.
is unruly?
Depend-
Because he doesn't want to
hopping-
deal
Okay,
with
no,
these
no, hold
questions.
on. Now, it's very
I have
clear.
responded to
on
your
John
questions,
Soros.
Jerry.
Let's go about it this way,
Yeah.
John. Now, with this particular story that we
Yes.
have, that is clearly a contention here.
Yes.
Now, for you, obviously, because you definitely get feedback to the work that you do, and
Yes.
that is coming out from Kenya, for example. If we look at the stories, just extrajudicial killings, for example, what kind of feedback did you get?
Very
in terms
divisive
of
feedback.
in terms of the impact that the story had, whether it was information that was then shared with the people for them to get the real information about what was really happening.
Yeah.
How was that in terms of feedback?
On the one hand, people agree, and that's something that we have to contend with in this society. People agree with the use of force in that way, if it is to get rid of perceived terrorists or criminals.
That it should
right?
be used.
That it should be used.
Okay.
On the other hand, people say that we are a rules-based society. We have a constitution. We have laws that we pass through parliament and that we all respect. They are put down in the constitution to protect the prurient interest in this country. Right? So if we cannot respect our laws, what separates us from those societies that are overrun by people who would use force, who would use extrajudicial means? And we've seen this happen across the world, where that kind of force is used. Where does it stop? Right? And that's really what a lot of people are coming to. I can't speak to the numbers, but a lot of people that I've spoken to over the past few years that have done these stories have come to the recognition of where does it stop?
Right.
It started with people who we agreed were very, very bad elements in our society. Then it moved on to people who we had some questions about. Then it moved on to just regular people.
Right.
Where does it stop? And that's the question that we're asking. I have huge numbers of friends and sources within the police force. I have friends within the military. Right. I respect the role that they play in this country. Not only do I respect it, I am grateful for it because they protect me as I sleep.
Right.
But at the same time, I cannot close my eyes to when excesses are being brought to
being
bear.
meted out to the public.
Exactly.
So
and
then I
meted
have
out
to
the
ask,
public.
with these stories, do you lay a question?
Yes.
Or do you lay an opinion?
I lay a
know
question.
you talked about, you looking at the architecture of this system
Yes.
and saying that in the future we hope that something is going to be done,
Yes.
that some reform will come about, some change will be experienced.
Yes.
But do you lay it in the minds of people to then ask these questions for yourself? Or are you saying, this is what I think from the rich array of resources that you have in terms of information?
Yes.
This is what I think based on what I have been told. Because I think the two are very, very important.
Yes, that's very important. I put it this way. I use the hypothesis. Police are doing this, that, and the other. I go and look for evidence that shows me that they're doing that and evidence that shows me that they aren't or that they are victims. For instance, in a story that we did called Where Are Our Children?
Right.
We focused on the problem of extrajudicial killings in different organizations. We also looked at the other side of how radicalization has led people outside of this country to come and do harm to this country, as well as to how criminals are using some elements within the police force to perpetrate crime, right? So we try and look at it as globally as possible and then lay the question, look, what is it that we are doing in our society? If we are unable to fix these things, then what kind of society do we have? Right?
Does it have to be sensationalist?
No, it
be able
doesn't.
to grab attention? Does it?
It
No.
doesn't. It doesn't. And as far as I can, I try not to sensationalize issues that are as sensitive as death, as sensitive as disaster, because I know what impact that can have. Right.
We have in the studio multi-award-winning investigative journalist John-Allan Namu of Africa Uncensored. We're talking about the impact of investigative journalism in society, in Kenya in particular. It's 13 minutes to 9 o'clock. I'm going to open up the phone lines now. 0719 012600. That's 0719 012600. Talk to John-Allan.
Complaints that I read about George Soros seems to come from world leaders. And so I get the impression that when world leaders or their country they represent are involved in regime changes in other countries, it isn't an issue. But when an individual is supposedly touted to have influenced change, because apart from the complaints that I read about, this is a man who's been involved in a lot of philanthropy. But this regime change narrative is the one that seems to hold center stage. So are we then, for instance, not supposed to take aid from France? We know what France is doing in West Africa. Are we then not supposed to take money from, say, the UK? We know what they do, wherever it is they do it. We know what Americans do. Are we not supposed to?
My line of questioning wasn't about whether we should take money from him or not. It's that when we do take money from the likes of George Soros, there's an agenda that he is peddling globally, and
who doesn't have an agenda actually?
No,
I mean,
that's another.
Speaking, who doesn't have an agenda?
Question.
But
Absolutely.
my other question
but
is
the fact that his is regime change, and then directly related to some of the documentaries that have been released about the government. You then question what John's agenda is, and he said he's got a very strong editorial policy. So I asked him, so would you take money from Al Qaeda? And say no, my editorial policy protects me from that.
But my
that
argument,
was my line of question.
Yes.
Now, there's no harm in taking money from George Soros. There's no harm in promoting his ideology.
Oh, there is harm, all right.
If you're going to admit it.
Oh, there's
but
harm.
admit it. Be open about it.
But
transparent.
did he not say? Did he not say?
But you were very adamant that you don't advance his ideology.
But
and
I
I
don't.
asked you about his ideologies.
I do not.
No, my question:
do not.
why are you insisting that
the
he
question has been
advances
answered.
the ideology?
It's important because
The
you
question
can't
has
take
been asked.
money
The
from
question has been
open
answered.
society and not be advancing the ideology.
Why not?
And
The
CT
ideologies
asked-
include
CT
the
asked
ideologies
a very
include
good
regime
question,
change.
right? Let's broaden this. Like, Kenya takes money from all of these different nations. Are they advancing their ideology? Right?
And the answer is
Yes.
Yes.
They are.
No, I don't have a problem with it. I
and-
just wanted to
Oh, you don't know.
I wanted you to bring it
Yes.
to the discussion so
Yes.
that people know that you do get money from George Soros,
Yes.
that he has been involved in regime change. He
Yes.
does interfere with governments.
Yes.
And then when we watch your documentaries, no, it's important.
So now
that
you are pushing an agenda.
No, I'm not pushing any agenda. It's important that
exactly
people
what
watch
you
your
asked.
documentaries
Yeah,
with the
and
full
Jerry,
knowledge of
okay.
this.
And I asked you a very clear question. Point me to the stories that we have done. Because as a journalist, the only way I can influence or be used to do something
It's
like
through
that
your stories.
is through my stories. So point me to them.
No, I think it's important now when the audience is watching what they're watching, they're aware that there has been funding in this programming that has come from an ideological billionaire like George Soros.
We've never hidden it. It is on our website.
Okay. Well, now
for
it is more
everybody
clear.
to go and
it is
see
more
and
clear,
interrogate.
and people
it's
are
only-
now
it's
more
clear
informed
now
as
to
to
you,
who George
Jerry, because you were not
Soros
It
aware
is clear because
earlier.
you've pushed it this whole hour.
Well, I mean,
But
we
it's
also
always
have the
been
Open
clear.
Society who supports initiatives against gender-based violence, for example, against helping
They
in
do a
family
lot of good.
planning, and
Don't get me
etc.,
wrong,
etc.
they
So
do a
there's a
lot of
lot
good.
others that they do. and we
Even
can apply
regime
the same
change is
narrative
good.
here.
It's not all regime changes, but
I
anyway.
have no problem. What was important is that we establish that George Soros funds your organization,
Yes.
and then we get to know who the man is. That's what I wanted to bring to the fore.
Okay.
We've
That's
brought that
fine.
to the
That has
forefront for
always
people to
been there.
decide,
I think-
am I going to watch this with bias or without?
John has always said his sources of funding have always been fair. They're there. They're published
there.
on the website.
Yeah.
They're clearly there. These are the organizations that support us, not only the Open Society, but many others.
For the same purpose that you're asking about, Njeri, for full disclosure.
Absolutely.
I would not
I'm-
put that
I'm
out
easy
there.
now.
Yeah, I would
Yeah.
not put that out there if I did not think that people shouldn't know about this.
There's something
That's
that
the entire point.
you mentioned, John, just to move on a bit. You talked about that thing of ensuring that we build a capacity of media houses
Yes.
and journalists in investigative journalism. And you said you think it should be publicly funded.
Yes.
Why? Why do you have such a strong feeling that this should be something, because it's for public good, that it should be public funded?
It is a public good.
All
right?
journalism is.
All journalism is a public good. And this is how I think it should be expressed. Our national broadcaster should be among the best in terms of leading the field with regard to the kind of journalism that it pushes, right? Our national broadcaster is in the doldrums, right? Let's compare this to another society that you guys were speaking about earlier, right? Scandinavian societies. Sweden has the SVT. SVT is a public broadcaster. SVT has year on year won the best investigative journalism awards, best journalism awards at their annual awards ceremony. Yeah. Some of the people who work for that organization are global leaders in terms of thought leaders in terms of investigative journalism, and yet they are publicly funded. It is because that society appreciates that for a society to move forward, for the plane to take off and to keep moving forward, that journalism, information must be produced and must be held at the heart of the public interest. And that's why I think that the public that the public should fund journalism generally, investigative journalism specifically. Perhaps now, like if we're talking about biases, that's where I have a bias, right? But journalism generally, and I've spoken about it. I think I published a TED talk on the same. Yeah.
How would we go about ensuring that this happens then? We already know the kind of issues that KBC has, right?
Yes.
We know, of course, KBC is governed by statute and all, and the kind of funding that it gets, it also has commercial, it has to raise its money also commercially.
Yes.
How would it be funding? Are you saying that it only funds the journalists who are within working for KBC, or how would it be able to fund you, for example, in your organization, or a journalist working for Standard Group?
Well, I guess there are different vehicles for that to happen. We could set up a fund, like a benevolent fund for journalists to be able to draw down, for philanthropists, local philanthropists, to be able to put money in it, and that fund can be managed by people who are independent of the strictures of journalism or the subjectivity that might come with knowing journalist A or journalist B. I mean, there are different methods, right? I don't have them all lined up, but that's one of the ways that I think could work. Yeah.
So journalism, of course, because being the fourth estate, putting the government in check and to account, of course, is a sort of a partner, but more so an enemy of the state as well. Do you see the state actually working to promote journalism, or do you see the state working to curtail advancement of journalism?
Currently, I think that it'll be very difficult for anybody to say that the state works full-time to promote journalism. I think how the Kenyan state promotes journalism is for allowing these kinds of discussions to happen. It could very well be that we'd have a situation like we have in Tanzania, where the kind of speech that the kind of conversation that we're having would not happen, right? Or a situation that we have in other countries where that does not happen. That in and of itself is an important marker to there being some protections or some appreciation for what journalism can do for a society. How I think it can move forward, like I said, there's examples across the world that have worked, where even when people, especially at the highest levels of government, appreciate and promote the principles of free speech, access to information, right, and the freedom of the media, then that in itself informs what kind of society can be built from beneath those levels or those layers of governance. Yeah.
I have something we've battled with quite often in this room. It may not lean specifically on investigative journalists, but we've also often asked ourselves, does the media give the public what they have created, or is it a reflection of what society is actually demanding? Which way is it? Because then we've also have to deal with the commercial and editorial perspectives of media, etc., etc. But is it is what is published in our dailies on television a reflection of society, or is it the other way around?
In some ways, it's both. In some ways, right? In some ways, you'll find stories there that are truly reflections of society, right? You'll find stories that really are reflections of how we live our lives and the kind of challenges we face, perhaps even the happy times that we face, right? But on the other end, I think this is why the model is collapsing, because content no longer plays a central role in attracting advertising and in attracting revenue, but the platform itself does. So advertiser A can come here because he can be seen, not because he identifies with a kind of affinity that the public has for content, but because they can be seen. Then, of course, we pivot away from what the original focus of the media was in terms of creating content that is a reflection of society. And then now that becomes a downward spiral, because then now anybody can come and advertise, and it becomes then, advertising eats up more and more and more and more space that should be taken up by journalism that is a reflection of the public. That's why those are the pressures that we face. And the internet has been a huge disruptor in this for the reasons that I stated earlier. You can publish, independently and have a following of millions. I mean, we have those examples here. And those people can then now say to advertisers, you guys come advertise with me. I have this kind of following. What does that do to media houses that depend on this?
So the models are changing.
I'm
headed to the end of the show. Of course, we'd like you to stay on as we go into the next conversation. So we've been talking about the impact of investigative journalism in the country and what it has. So the next one, we're talking about the Amos Wako, Nyeri, and what the US ban on the former Attorney General.
And his family being guilty by association. I think it's something we need to discuss.
That's what we'll be discussing, John, so in the next hour. So close this conversation on investigative journalism in 30 seconds.
In 30 seconds.
Take 40.
If it can ever be closed.
I don't think it can be closed,
Right.
but this is what I'd say. I think that Kenya stands in a very good position to be the leader in terms of freedom of media, leading the field in terms of investigative journalism, and leading the field in other ways with regard to media. I think that what people need to do is to remember the kind of gains that have been made as expressed through the media, the kind of battles that have been faced in newsrooms, and look forward with a bit more hope than they do. Not to leave us without criticism, right? Not to poke holes, in the things that we do, but to hold dear the principles that we exist to protect.
Thank you very much, John. Multi-award-winning investigative reporter John-Allan Namu, the co-founder of Uncensored, has been with us for the last 1 hour discussing the impact of investigative journalism in the country. Thank you for all your comments as well. We've seen them, many of them on Facebook. Of course, you'll be addressing them as well on Twitter via the hashtag The Situation Room. Good morning. It's 9 o'clock.